Hello everyone, this is Jason from Primetime Aquatics, and in this video I'm going to be bringing you one of the coolest freshwater fish out there, and that is we're going to talk about how to care for and breed discus fish. They are awesome, and I'm really excited because we're going to be featuring a 3,000 gallon discus fish aquarium that I think is one of the coolest tanks I've ever seen. We're going to clear up a lot of confusion. I hope you enjoy the video. And by the way, if you're new to the channel, consider subscribing. We do a lot of videos just like this, species profiles. We talk about fish tank water parameters, filtration, do a lot of fish store, fish room tours. Hope you enjoy the video. So this is a 3,000 gallon discus display tank that we saw at the Wonders of Wildlife Museum and Aquarium in Springfield, Missouri. If you ever have a chance to check it out, highly recommend it. This was a fantastic tank, lots of really cool displays. By the way, the features that you see there with those cylinders, those plastic cylinders, when the display is fully open, kids can go underneath the tank and they can actually pop their heads up through that little cylinder. It's almost like being inside the tank. It's a really cool feature. So let's go ahead and talk about discus care and breeding. The scientific name, the genus, is Symphysidon. There are a few species named. Aquifasciatus is one of them, probably the most common. Now, these are fish that have a lot of confusion when it comes to keeping them. People think that they are nearly impossible to keep. They're a lot of work. They are a little bit of work, but as we're going to see, not quite as bad as they're made out to be. So this is a fantastic tank, and I hope as we go through and talk about discus, you can learn a lot just from looking at the setup in this 3,000 gallon tank. So these fish, discus, are from South America. They are from the Amazon River Basin. The water there is fairly warm. It's also got a very low pH and low water hardness. So when we're keeping these fish in an aquarium, there's a little bit more flexibility in some of the water parameters than one might think. The temperature, we're generally going to want to keep these fish around 83 to 86 degrees. Now obviously that temperature is a little warmer than you might be keeping other tropical fish, and that's going to present some challenges for us. When it comes to other water parameters, I already mentioned that the pH is relatively low in nature. What I have found, what many people have found who keep these fish, is the pH, you can generally, they're going to do best right around a pH of 6 to 7. So if you naturally have a pH that's a little bit on the lower side, these are potentially a great option for you, but they can be kept healthily in the pH of the mid to even upper 7s. I've known many people who keep them at that pH, and as long as the pH is stable, they seem to do fairly well. Now, if you're going to breed them, keeping them closer to that ideal pH is going to be more advisable. When it comes to water hardness, ideally you're going to want to be between 1 to 4 degrees hardness. That's very soft water. I think that's where a lot of potential issues come in when it comes to keeping the water parameters stable. More on that in a moment. But they can go up from there in that 5 to even 8 degrees hardness. I know many people who keep them at that hardness without any issues, but once again, if you want to breed them, keeping them closer to ideal conditions is going to be better. Now, when it comes to water parameters in general and water quality, I think this is something that scares a lot of people away from keeping discus. They hear that you have to do 50% water changes every day or the fish aren't going to survive. If you are doing good aquarium maintenance, just generally speaking, you can keep discus. And the idea here is you want to try to keep your nitrates at 20 parts per million or less, and that's pretty much what you're trying to do for most of your fish anyway. So if you're doing that, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. The issue, I think, for a lot of people when keeping discus is if you are keeping them in very soft water with very low carbonate hardness, you don't have a lot of buffering capacity. And so one of the things you really have to make sure of is when you are doing the water changes, that the water parameters are consistent compared to what's already in the tank, because if they're not, that's where problems can arise, because now you have fluctuations in pH if you have very low carbonate hardness and very poor buffering capacity. So if you can keep your nitrates below 20 parts per million and match the water parameters compared to what's in the tank and what's going into the tank, you're going to be a lot better off. Now, people keep these fish obviously because they are some of the most beautiful freshwater fish you can possibly imagine. You look at the colors that we're showing you in this video, and they are absolutely mind-blowing. These fish can get large, somewhere between the 7 to 9 inches in diameter, so they can get very, very big. That presents a little bit of a challenge for us. Again, once we are thinking about the aquarium sizes, their temperament, they're generally relatively peaceful, but they are cichlids, and so they might show some aggression towards one another. Their lifespan, you might get 8 to 10 years out of them if you are keeping them in the proper water parameters. Now, when it comes to tank mates, and I think that's one of the things that's so cool about looking at this display tank, you can get an idea of what is being kept with these fish. Neon tetras, cardinal tetras, you saw some rummy nose tetras in there as well. There are a few clown loaches in this tank as well. German blue rams might be an option. One of the things you have to consider is, one, you're going to need fish that can handle that higher temperature, so somewhere around 83 to 86, and the fish that I just mentioned, generally speaking, can do that. But the other thing that you have to consider is discus eat relatively slowly, and you don't want to have fish in the tank that are going to outcompete them for food, because the other issue is they eat slowly, but usually after a few minutes they're done eating, and you don't want to have a lot of leftover food at the bottom of a tank that's going to make water conditions not ideal for your fish. So again, the tank mates, you can see the tetras here. German blue rams, maybe. People have also done bristlenose plecos. I have found bristlenose plecos will do fine in the lower 80s, 83, 84. There are some plecos out there that actually like those higher temperatures in the mid to upper 80s, so you could take a look at that. The only thing I want to caution you against is if you're going to be putting any type of pleco in your tank, these discus are wide-bodied fish. You don't want the plecos deciding that the mucus secretions of your discus are a food source. That could complicate matters. Let's talk a little bit about fish tank size. There's a lot of varying opinions on the internet about what size is appropriate for your discus. Obviously, we don't all have a 3,000-gallon aquarium like this one, but we can take steps to make sure our discus are happy and healthy and comfortable in their environment. I have seen recommendations as low as 55 gallons. For me personally, if I were keeping discus, I would not put them in anything less than a 90-gallon, and there's a few reasons for that. We've already mentioned the size. At 7 to 9 inches at max size, these are going to be large-bodied fish. The second thing is they are cichlids, and so at least amongst themselves, if you're going to be keeping them in a group, they may become slightly territorial. The other issue is if they start to breed, they're going to need some extra space away from other fish as the pairs start to form. As you can see, even in this display tank, we've got quite a number of pairs. So you're going to be better off probably keeping them in a larger tank. And when we're talking about tank mates, going back to that, you see a lot of these fish are really cool, but I think one of the most interesting types of tanks when it comes to discus is keeping a large group of discus in a tank. And of course, you're going to need a larger tank for that. So in my opinion, you're safest with a 90-gallon or above. And not only that, the water parameters in those larger tanks are going to be easier to stabilize compared to a smaller tank. And when it comes to decorating your discus tank, there's a lot of options, but I think a nice sand would do well. Rocks, wood. You can do live plants, but again, you have to be careful. The live plants can handle those higher temperatures. So maybe something like anubias. As you can see in this tank, there's a lot of anubias. There's some java fern. There is some sword plants in there as well, some other types of plants. But those three for sure are probably going to be able to handle those higher temperatures a little bit better. And it's just going to make it a little bit easier to aquascape your tank. Now, when it comes to feeding discus, here variety is king. Yes, they will eat high protein diets, so your frozen bloodworms, your frozen brine shrimp, lots of people feed beef heart, although I would probably feed not as much of that compared to the two that I've already mentioned. Something like a really high quality flake food like a Northfin flake food or a Northfin Bug Pro might be a good option, but even your community flakes, discus can be a little bit finicky, so you're just going to have to make sure that you can get your discus on flake foods and pellets. Wild discus are going to be a little bit harder to feed than the tank raised and bred discus that you would normally purchase at a store, so kind of keep that in mind as well. I think one super important thing that we have to consider when you are establishing your discus tank, whether it's adding discus to your tank or adding other fish to your tank, it is so important to make sure that you quarantine the fish that are entering that new environment. I've done a video on quarantining fish. I'm going to put that in the upper right-hand corner. If you haven't seen that and you're thinking about keeping discus, I can't stress it enough. Watch that video because you're going to want to make sure that you can quarantine your fish properly. Discus can sometimes be prone to disease, and the last thing you want is expensive fish getting diseases. Speaking of cost, Discus do often cost more than many other types of freshwater fish. I think the cost may be worth it when you look at the colors and you look at their behavior. They're absolutely outstanding, but they do get pricey. Even small discus at the size of 2 to 3 inches, depending on where you buy them, can run easily $50 or $60 a piece. And so we want to make sure we can care for them from the very beginning. Let's talk a little bit about discus breeding. Obviously, you're going to need a male and a female, and as you saw in the display tanks, there were a number of pairs, and they were laying eggs on the vertical sides of logs and decorations. They will lay eggs on leaves. If you are intentionally trying to breed your discus, a breeding cone might be a good option. What's going to happen is after they lay the eggs, they are going to become more territorial potentially, and it's going to take a few days for those eggs to hatch. After they do, the fry are going to feed on the mucus secretions of the parents. After about 4 or 5 days, you can begin to introduce live baby brine shrimp. That'll give the parents a little bit of a break. And if the parents are at all fighting, you might want to remove one of them to a separate tank, and then you can leave the other parent in to continue to feed the fry the mucus secretions. So the big issue there is you are going to have to really step up your water change game. If you've got any uneaten food, we want to make sure the water parameters are very consistent for your fry. So that is a little bit about discus. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoyed this awesome display tank. If you did enjoy it, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.